I'm going to start a little bit earlier in Mark. When Mark describes Jesus and the disciples in a storm, and there is tumult, there is fear, they are shocked and afraid, they wake Jesus up, he commands the storm to stop. Mark says they ask each other a question. They say, who is this that the wind and the waves obey him? So it's during their journey with Jesus, and they are marveled at who they're with, and a bit perplexed. After they experience Jesus' death and resurrection, they've got a much better idea. And so John, who is in that boat, asking, who is this who can command the winds and the waves? Later says, through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Later, Paul, who had his own encounter with Jesus, was able to explain, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. John also later wrote, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. And later, for to be sure, he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by God's power. Have you ever wondered at how, like in old and new paintings of the Passion, Jesus is looking down, or he's looking up, averting your gaze, as though what happened was a kind of private thing. And we watch as silent witnesses to something that looks closed by history, colluding with the artist a little bit maybe, as though we were never there and it's all in the past. Otto Dix subverts that a little bit and has Jesus looking right at us, inviting us to ask the question, where are we in this event that marks and changes history? And I suppose today I'm asking one of those questions. How do we, as people who walk following Jesus, relate to this, and how do we encounter it? And I'm going to go back for a moment to a painting I've already showed. And this was something that was commissioned, I don't know who it was commissioned by, to be honest, but it was painted by Matthias Grunewald. And he was asked to particularly paint this. And if we look at Mark's Gospel, I think it can be interesting just to reflect a little bit how Mark's Gospel interacts with this painting. In Mark's Gospel, and first of all, let's just decode this a little bit. I do try and avoid showing a sort of white European Jesus, especially in a modern world. But here we are. This was painted in the 17th century, early 1600s. And Matthias Grunewald puts John the Baptist in here. Now, John the Baptist is dead by this stage, so he's using some artistic license. And the text is saying, he must become more, I must become less. It's a quote from John. Matthias Grunewald also has a very Germanic-looking, ginger-haired John the Baptist. and Mary, Mother of God. Mother of God, Mother of Jesus. Now, in Mark's Gospel, it is remarkable to see how alone Jesus is. There is no, did I say John Baptist? The disciple John. That's what I meant, right? You all just followed that. Thank you very much. There is no disciple John and Jesus' mother Mary at the foot of the cross in Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel is, in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is utterly alone. He does have a centurion standing here, perhaps, in Mark's Gospel, declaring as Jesus died, this was the Son of God. Now we know from Mark's Gospel that this sort of cross at the top was carried by Simon of Cyrene, who was from Libya. Equivalent. We know that this cross was probably hoisted by Romans. And Matthias Grunewald includes the sort of alabaster jar and this woman praying. Mark doesn't name who this woman is, but we know that Jesus at this stage must have had like 20,000 pounds worth of perfume poured all over him. So even on the cross, he must have had this strange mix of perfume and blood. And the perfume, Google tells me, pure nard, comes from the mountain slopes of Afghanistan. And the myrrh with which he was interred, or not interred, that's the wrong word, put into the tomb, would have probably come from Yemen. And the story is about a Jew named Jesus who grew up in Africa. So already have hints that this is a global event that changes and shapes all events in the world. When Jesus dies and is laid in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, Mark does say that the two witnesses to that were Mary, Jesus' mother, and Mary Magdalene. Now this painting was painted for a particular purpose, and I'd like to explore just a little bit of that. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was painted for a hospital in northeastern France, Alsace. Maybe it was part of like Prussia, I don't know the right terms. But it was in a time of plague. There were lots of plagues in the 17th century, bubonic and black, maybe they're the same thing, I don't know. But there was a particular plague in this area around the towns that had been going for like a long, long time. And Christians had gathered together and to look after members of this who were struck by this plague. The plague, we now know, is ergotism. But then it didn't have any name, you didn't understand what it was from. We now know that it's from a mold that grows on rye bread, the flour that you make rye bread from. If you eat the rye bread, you can get this terrible disease. But it was seen as a curse and a plague. Let's imagine for a moment that we were sufferers of this. If we were sufferers of this plague, we would have like pock marks all over our body. The mold is actually used these days LSD is derived from it. So people have terrible hallucinations, dreadful mental health issues. Your hands and your feet and your limbs became distorted. And you were cast out. Because it was understood that this was a curse from God, or at the very least a danger to the rest of society. So if you experience this, you are cast out. And Matthias Grunewald painted this painting for the chapel in a hospice that was looking after these folk until they died. So Christians gathered together as part of their ministry would welcome sufferers of ergotism, which had all sorts of other names. I think some of the names had to do with the spasms that it gave you. Imagine being cast out of home, cast out of community, feeling the weight of God's judgment upon you, and being alone. and seeking and hearing refuge of this community that look after people like you, like me. And imagine coming into this community and receiving a welcome. A place where you're not cast out, a place where a place is prepared for you. You're asked to go to chapel, which is part of the deal. And you go to chapel. And as you come in, this is an altarpiece. It's really large. At the front of the chapel is this huge altarpiece. And at first, you identify with Jesus because Jesus is clearly going through extraordinary pain. And I think I've imagined this myself, and I just think I would be coming into this chapel with such dissonance myself, because I know that what is happening in my life is so dreadful. I'm experiencing pain, and personally I would be fearful of God's judgment. I'm coming into a place that's holy. I'm coming into a place to encounter a God who is holy and pure. And I can imagine kneeling down and looking up, and slowly looking a little bit more carefully, and seeing in Jesus' body the pockmarks of my own, and seeing in his distorted limbs the signs of my own disease, and seeing in distorted feet the signs of the plague. And I think in those moments, there's just a tremendous realization of what the cross is. That it's not for us if we're feeling okay. But the cross is a place for those of us who know we're not okay. And as we come to the cross, we find that judgment is exhausted. The only judgment as we come before Jesus on the cross, Jesus has taken to himself, and there's none left for us. Instead, we have a remarkable solidarity of God, for whom the world was made, through whom the world was made, allowing himself to identify and stand with us. Now sometimes it can seem that Jesus looks like a victim, but he chose to go to the cross. And in my mind's eye, he's no victim at all. He's holding it all. He has it all. And although he's pinned out, he's sort of stretching that cross. He's through time and space till those two ends are reconciled in himself. And he's doing something cosmic and extraordinary. If you were a sufferer of egotism and you're kneeling in front of this altarpiece, at some stage during the service, an orderly in some kind of robe comes up and starts fiddling with it. And there's little hinges here, and during the service, it sort of envelopes open. And although you've experienced something of the liberty, because you've seen in Jesus something of a brother who understands, who embraces, who welcomes, who takes our infirmities, someone who in weakness was crucified, as it's opened up, you see a different picture. I excuse the sort of European slant here, but you see a picture of Matthias Grönewold's idea of the resurrection, where suddenly these pockmarks are all gone from disease, where the limbs are not contorted, where there is resurrection and freedom. And so, while the cross invites us into our weakness, into solidarity with God, the resurrection invites us into that promise. I don't know about you, but if you think of the notion of purity, like if you're a 17th century Christian German folk, maybe this is your picture of what purity looks like. When I think of purity, like those of you South African will identify with me, I think of a baby food brand. You don't get that here, right? Purity. No. Go to South Africa, I think it's the only brand you get. Purity. And it's easy to think, okay, this is what purity looks like. This is what holiness looks like. But in the cross, Jesus gives us a very different picture of purity and holiness. When I think of purity, what doesn't come to mind is a gasping for breath, or blood, hard and broken afresh. Purity doesn't make me think of sweat and reek. How strange then that purity from God's point of view looks a bit like this. It isn't cleanliness. Holiness and purity isn't like unused. It's not white as snow. But from Jesus' perspective, from God's perspective, it looks like purity to me. It's like crud and blood running down a man's legs, congealed. And he embracing that taint. It's a man stripped of clothes, privates exposed, arms pinned out to mock his modesty, and to keep the women standing far off. Mark explains that the women are there, the men, they've just dissolved, they've disappeared. And we know why, because just before chapter 15, Peter denies Jesus 3 times. All the disciples, the men, have abandoned Jesus. The women are there, but they're standing far off. Why? Because I think Jesus is naked. They're trying to protect something of his modesty. Probably why his mother doesn't hesitate to go forward in John's Gospel. And we know what nakedness is like in the Jewish culture. If you read stories of Genesis and other areas, nakedness is a big deal. And that's part of the shame of the cross. To be pinned out naked for people to see. I said that Jesus was alone. He was alone because he had no friends. And he gives cry to that in a psalm. He quotes the psalm and says, and Mark tells us this, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? But he's not alone because he's with people who are mocking him and saying, you saved yourself. I mean, you saved others, save yourself now. And say, let's see if Elijah comes to save the guy. Let's see if God's promise is on him. Let's see if he is someone of God's favor. And I think what's important is that when you come to purity, this is a good picture of what purity looks like for our world. Like the resurrection picture, that's what purity can look like for a new world. In this world, purity doesn't last very long in our sort of cleanliness concept of purity. That just doesn't last because we are living in a broken world where terrible things happen. But for me, it is a tremendous consolation that Jesus didn't become any less pure for being beaten, afflicted, this nakedness being exposed. He became no less holy. And it reminds me that we can't become less holy by what other people do to us, whatever that is. What someone does to me can make me feel violated, can make me feel dirty. But that's what purity looks like in this world. It does get taken advantage of. And in that there is a wonderful solidarity with Jesus, who knows all our weaknesses. So purity for a broken world, I think, looks a bit like this. Maybe in heaven it's clean as snow. Here, it's more likely to smell and shock and have the stain of a bully. But be no less pure. Almost like sullied pure. It's a strange thing I'm saying. but I think it's true. Joseph Coney, Joseph Coney, that's really bad. He's the rebel in DRC. James Coney, who's a theologian. Yes. James Coney is phenomenal. He's written some, if you like any recommendations on some of his books, I can give them to you afterwards. But he writes and says, the cross, and he's looking particularly at recent US history and race relations and those sorts of things. He says the cross is a paradoxical religious symbol because it inverts the world's value system with the news that hope comes by way of defeat. Suffering and death do not have the last word. And this is a very imperfect picture by Matthias Grunewald in his own worldview. But he has Jesus rising, stupendous, reconciled to his I don't know what, an expression of his godliness, I suppose. And the Roman soldiers are taken aback or they sort of look as though they've fallen into a sleep of sorts. But for now, I think we're stuck here. For now. And this is where we make sense. I'm a bit Catholic, deep down. And so there's a sort of sense, I don't know if it's come from my Catholicism or it's just me, but there's a certain sense of dread in approaching God. There's a certain sense of, I think dread is the best word. Like in my imagination, I imagine approaching God and just dwindling and reducing by turns because of, like, who I'm not. But the cross really does invite us into a safe space where there is no dread. There is only welcome solidarity and relief from judgment. Because Jesus has taken it all. There's also not a place where we bluff and say, oh, it's all good. It's not. There's a solidarity in living in this broken world. And here we will remain for some time. Just before I finish, just one sort of echo, I think, from Mark. Mark comes up to the death and resurrection of Jesus in the early chapters and spends quite a long time on Jesus, on Peter's denial. Jesus tells him, "You're going to deny me 3 times." He says, "No." The cock crows. Peter realizes that he has abandoned Jesus Christ. Where is he? He's definitely not at the crucifixion. Where is the man? I do not know. But the angel, when the angel in Mark meets the women, and it's the women who play all the big roles in the end of Mark, the angel says to the women, to Mary, "Go and tell the disciples and Peter that Jesus will meet them in Galilee." Now Peter takes his own sort of expression of the cross with him wherever he goes. And that's the cockerel. I was in Bologna like a few weeks ago, and I visited earlier, and I go to this church, and there's a big courtyard, and it's full of cockerels. And I'm like, "Why are the cockerels?" And they said, it's Peter's, it's to remember Peter. And you know that, like, at the moment, we have churches with crosses on the top. Like, there was a time in the Middle Ages where that wasn't allowed at all. The equivalent of the Pope decided, no, we've got to have cockerels. Because a cockerel is the symbol of what a Christian is. It's a symbol of weakness. It's a reminder that we all fail dreadfully. And it's a reminder that, as with Peter, there is a way to restoration. And so at the very end, the angel says, "Go tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee, where he will teach you many things, and Peter." I can just imagine Mary coming. I don't know if Peter's with the disciples, because he must feel ashamed, maybe he is. But the Mary says, the angel said, "He'll meet you in Galilee." And he specifically mentioned Peter. which is a wonderful story. And I think I can imagine, like, if there's a sort of sense of dissonance, of inadequacy, I can just imagine an angel coming and saying, go and tell the disciples, and John, and Nick, and Doug, whatever. Like, there is a wonderful, gracious embrace from God. It's just fantastic. So let me summarize where I am, what I've tried to share. Jesus' death is an illustration of what happens to God on earth. And Jesus got there not by taking control, but by releasing control. And he invites us into that same release. And it is terrifying. But we have an extraordinary promise that death is not the last word. And sin does not have the last word. And it's by way of defeat that actually hope is born. And God invites us into a new community. And if you take anything from today, maybe you can just imagine an angel. Please tell the disciples Jesus is waiting for them. And maybe we can just close our eyes and I'll briefly pray. Lord Jesus, sometimes we are, well, I'll say I, and I'll invite others to say I who can say I authentically to what I'm about to say, but sometimes when I come into your presence, I'm afraid, and I do feel inadequate. Lord Jesus, you have it all, and through you the whole world was made, including me, for you. And yet you have taken all my inadequacies upon yourself. And Lord, I give you praise that you invite us into your presence. And not only into your presence where we have solidarity, but you also invite us into your promise. Lord, a promise we can only guess at. But we praise and thank you for inviting us into your promise. So Lord, please help us to make sense of all the things we're worried about right now, all our struggles, and our failings, and our burdens. And help us to also grasp in some way the promise without leaving the present. Lord, lead us in your